preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you. Now I want to introduce our guest of honor. He graduated from Yale University and Jesus College in Cambridge, England. In 1993, became contributing editor of the New York Times Magazine. He's written for a number and writes for a number of publications, The New Yorker, Art Forum, New York Times, amongst many others. He's published several successful books, both fiction and nonfiction. In 1998, he published an article called The Anatomy of Melancholy in The New Yorker, which received tremendous response and acclaim. And out of this article, which combined both his personal struggle with depression and extended research, grew his book, The Noonday Demon. A finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the 2001 National Book Award, Books for a Better Life Award, the American Library Association for Notable Book. Actually, if I name all of the awards, we will not have an evening with our guest. There have been so many. It's published as well in 21 languages. As a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, I would like to say that his book has filled a real void in the area of understanding depression. Never has a book looked so comprehensively at this illness, a part of the human condition, with such completeness. He illustrates personally, culturally, politically, historically, philosophically, as well as medically and psychologically, how depression can cut a path of annihilating destruction, and yet for some who are able to make their way through it, can harness the experience to grow as human beings. His personal revelations strike a poignant chord for all who have suffered depression and gives hope at the same time that they too can fight it, understand it, and use it. It is a real treat for us to get to hear straight from the horse's mouth what his experiences and understanding of the Noonday Demon are. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Andrew Solomon.
Thank you.
So we've just been chatting a little bit, and Andrew's been telling me about his travels all over for this book, and I thought it would be interesting to hear a little bit about your views of how, when you've been traveling, depression may be viewed differently in other cultures. You've been particularly in Europe.
Right. I've just come back actually about 12 hours ago from Madrid, the book having just been launched in Spain. Let me start, by the way, by thanking all of you for coming through the stormy weather. That's fantastic. It's been actually a very interesting process launching the book in a variety of countries because you go to a country for about 3 days for a book launch and you get interviewed by a huge number of press people. And it's a very intense, rather abbreviated experience. You get quite a curious angle on the culture on the basis of what kinds of questions get asked and how they get phrased. So it was striking to me that when I was in some Scandinavian countries for launches there, everybody assumes that you understand that they're depressed. People, by and large, tell you a little bit about their depression as an opening gambit in having the conversation. They then tell you about other people who have been depressed. The marketing of the book is predicated on the notion that everyone has suffered from depression, that everyone knows that everyone else has suffered from depression. There's a kind of jolly community of mutual depression that grows up around that. And in Spain, where I just was, the cover of the book in Spain actually looks like a container of orange juice. It's an incredibly cheerful, bright orange, kind of up and go get 'em kind of cover. And people said to me, well, we've got a big issue, which is whether people are going to find it humiliating to go into a store and buy a book that says that it's about depression. And they were setting up various mail order schemes for people who'd find it too embarrassing to go into a store and buy a book, the purchase of which might suggest that they had at some point suffered from depression. And then as I had interviews with journalists, they were all incredibly cheerful interviews, and people sort of brought champagne and brought fruit and brought all kinds of things to sort of be celebratory. And there was this sense that if the people I was talking to were depressed, one journalist actually admitted that she had been depressed a long time ago. But if the people I was talking to had a particular interest in the subject through personal contact with the illness, that was not going to be shared or discussed, though other kinds of intimacy were to prevail. So Yeah.
Well, actually, I think you bring up another important issue, which you talk about in the book, but I wonder if you can expand on the issue of stigma and shame in depression, and how, I mean, in my opinion, affects not only the ability for people to come to treatment, but even our healthcare reimbursement. I mean, that it sort of the trickle down effect of people feeling that it's not really an illness, and maybe we just can't even reimburse that much for it.
Yes. I've been working actually on Tipper Gore's National Mental Health Awareness Campaign, which is a campaign against stigma. And so I've recently been looking at a lot of the stigma issues, and the insurance issue is a big one. There is still an underlying sense that good, decent, upright people don't get depressed, or if they do, that they can solve the problem by themselves. And I encounter frequently, and I suppose there was quite a lot of it implicit in the experience I had in Spain, but it's also just the case sort of across the board, a lot of people who will come up to me and talk about their depression in very secretive ways. Geographically, it's quite striking. When I'm in the New York area, people will mostly sort of be quite outspoken about what they've been through. I've done a certain amount of touring with the book also in the Midwest. And in Milwaukee, I gave a reading, and afterwards there were almost 100 people who waited to have books signed, almost every one of whom told me the story of their particular depression or their son's suicide or something like that, almost all of whom whispered. They didn't want the other people standing around to hear them talking about these things because they felt that they were very personal and very secret, in a way that I think they would not have felt if I had written a book about arthritis and they were all sort of coming up to talk to me about their arthritis. The effect of this stigma, which is out there, is that people frequently don't seek the treatments that they should for depression. They frequently feel too embarrassed by it to talk to their doctor. Even if they talk to the doctor, they don't talk to the people around them. I tell a story in the book about a couple who I met in England, actually, but they were at a weekend conference that I was at, and on Friday, the wife in this couple took me aside and she said to me, I have suffered from depression and I don't really like to talk about it, and don't say anything to my husband because he's not very emotionally in touch and he wouldn't really understand it, but this is what's been going on and I wanted your advice on the following matters. And so I gave her, I hope, some useful advice. And on Sunday, her husband took me aside and said, my wife wouldn't really respect me if she knew about this, but actually I've had a bit of a problem myself. And it turned out that the two of them were taking the same medication, and each of them was hiding it from the other in a different part of their bedroom. And so I just feel as though the stigma reduces the intimacy that people can have with each other. This lack of openness leaves people keeping up masks and living in a masquerade. And that masquerade, though it can be amusing to narrate, is actually very damaging and very dangerous for the people who are caught in it. And then we get to this congressional issue that mental health coverage is not given at the same rate as physical health coverage. So if you have got if you've got epilepsy, that for some reason has been classed as a physical illness and you get full insurance coverage for it. But if you have depression or even manic depression or even schizophrenia, that probably will be covered at a much lower rate because those are sort of mind illnesses. And there's some suggestion as we get more and more of an ability to use brain scans to demonstrate the physicality of mental illnesses, that we'll be able on that basis ultimately to say these really are physical illnesses and should be covered at the same rate as other physical illnesses. But my own radical belief is that even if they weren't physical illnesses, since they are illnesses and cause enormous suffering and enormous pain and enormous lack of functioning, and since one has to have them treated in order to remain alive, that it would make sense for insurance companies or for federal insurance plans that cover illness to cover that illness as much as any other illness. I find the sort of basis of the distinction appalling, so that even as that distinction begins to break down, I think the attitudes that remain are attitudes of severe and terrible prejudice, which have got an enormous physical cost for the people who don't have coverage, therefore don't get treatment, and therefore spend their lives dysfunctional or kill themselves.
I was actually recently at a talk where Patrick Kennedy talked about his struggle with depression, but that he had to park his car in a different locations so no one would know that he was visiting his therapist. Now, obviously, he was now coming out publicly with this, but it seems to me that politicians might be able to make a difference. I wonder.
Politics is the field in which the secrecy seems to be most urgent, politics and the military. And there was a poll done not that long ago in which some academics made random telephone calls to people and said, I'm going to describe someone who is your ideal candidate. Tell me what all the ideal things are you would want in a candidate. He said, now, if you knew someone had all of those ideal qualifications, but you found out that that person had been treated for depression, it wasn't even that that person is being treated for depression or has depression. If you found out that person had been treated for depression, would you still vote for him or her? And almost a third of people said no. In that case, they wouldn't vote for the person in question. There are a few people with prominent positions in national politics who have talked openly about their depression. Lynn Rivers is a member of Congress who has manic depression, and she's sort of the poster child for this matter. But by and large, I think politicians believe that it would severely limit their electability if people found out they had been depressed. And what's most disturbing is that they're quite possibly right. There's more openness in politics, there's more openness in the corporate world than there has been, but still truly public acknowledgments are considered dangerous and suspect.
Well, speaking of public acknowledgments, how do you feel at this point? I mean, this is your personal story is quite out there, and now that you've traveled the world and it's read all over the world, how do you feel about that?
Well, I would say essentially it's just fine. But I would say that when one gets into a society in which there is an enormous stigma associated with the illness, a certain self-consciousness comes in. I mean, I was a writer living in New York, and so for me to admit to people around me that I had experienced depression and taken antidepressants seemed like no big deal. But I get into the middle of the Midwest, or I get into a country like Spain, and I find myself sitting there, and there is a certain air of kind of morbid fascination that people sometimes have when they talk to me about kind of, gee, you have this strange thing and you talk to it. It can be very uncomfortable and very unsettling. Essentially, though, I felt that it was not going to bear a significant cost for me professionally, socially, personally, to talk openly about my depression. I think the more people talk openly about depression, the more that the stigma will fall away. So I felt a great sense of political agenda about it, and I've been satisfied in the realization of that political agenda. I'm very admiring of people like Tipper Gore, who have had very prominent positions in society and who have then spoken openly about their experiences with depression. I think it accomplishes a great deal when people talk about it that way. And finally, and I often find myself saying this to people who say, God, I'm depressed, but I just could never really tell anyone. People assume that if you open up and talk about your depression, that you will be looked at with pity and disdain. That's kind of the underlying notion, and obviously very much attached to the stigma question. In fact, I found that in most instances, if you talk openly about your depression, one-on-one to people in an informal setting, that most people's response is not horror, but recognition. And what people say to you is not, how could you have had something like that, but rather, God, well, my depression started on such and such a day, and or at the very most, gee, I've been really worried about my sister because she seems to have gone through my husband was on Prozac for a while and he seems to be okay now. And it's such a widespread phenomenon, and until I wrote about it and spoke about it so openly, and had the experience of so many people coming to tell me their own stories, I had read a lot of numbers and statistics, but I had very little appreciation for how many people are depressed. And I would say that rather than scaring people off, the depression has thrown me into, and the open discussion of it, has thrown me into intimacies with people, a huge number of people with whom I might otherwise not have had any contact.
Mm-hmm. Depression, is such a broad word. And, as a psychiatrist, I do sometimes see people who are concerned about their sadness or their irritability or their frustration. And yet sometimes seems to me that what they're experiencing is part of human emotion, that we have this wide range of human emotion, and maybe, and in fact, it's not compromising their functioning and so on, but is just difficult for them to tolerate much of whatever it is, that it feels very difficult for them. And I wonder what, that depression can go from, people use the word depressed to say, they feel sad today, to, states of terrible illness. And I wonder, what do you think about that spectrum, that less severe spectrum?
Well, in the first place, I think the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality, and that the essence of depression lies not in feeling very sad, but in having a kind of breakdown in your ability to function and interact with the world and be in the world. Enormous grief, I think, is part of the human mood spectrum. I don't take a very moral position, though. It seems to me there are some people who feel enormous grief and feel that they can tolerate that grief. And for them, it seems like a part of the necessary human experience. There are other people for whom what sounds descriptively like a lesser degree of grief is intolerable and whose lives are being ruined by it. And it seems to me that life is finite and that one ought to try to get through it experiencing both the most profundity, and one doesn't want to sort of medicate away emotions that will make people shallow, but we don't have the capacity to do that, and I'm not persuaded that we ever will. You want to have the most intense and profound and engaged, and ultimately, I hope, at least to some degree, pleasurable experience of life that you can. Being sort of high on cocaine all the time ultimately has a lot of destructive ramifications. Taking antidepressants, they come with certain side effects, they come at a certain price. Seeking treatment with a psychiatrist and talking therapy for depression occupies a lot of time and has moments of regression and moments that can be very painful. But ultimately, I think people should be entitled to have as good a mood as it's reasonably possible for them to have. So I try not to moralize about those emotional states. But I do meet people who have got the artificial idea, which comes out of, I think, sort of cheap rhetoric that began around Prozac, that somehow life is supposed to be a matter of laughter and song, and who feel as though if their life isn't a matter of laughter and song on any particular day, there's something wrong and they should do something about it right away. And I think it's important to help people. It's what you need to do as a psychiatrist and do, I'm sure, but to help people recognize, all right, well, these are emotions which are somewhat painful, but from which I learn something and through which I grow. And these are emotions which are actually, I mean, maybe I would grow in some way by going through them, but basically are empty and barren and hollow, and to try to distinguish which are which, and which are things that one should escape if one possibly can, and which are things to which one has to be open. But it's a subtle question. I think it varies enormously, really, from person to person, that what for one person is meaningful for another person is barren, and that you have to really assess it by person. And so some of this sort of attempts to be scientific about depression end up being rather unsuccessful. And I, in the book, take exception to the definition of depression given in the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which says you have depression when you have X number out of X number of symptoms. And sometimes you have only one symptom, but you have it so badly that you're paralyzed by it. And sometimes you have all of those symptoms, but quite mildly. And some people can have all of those symptoms, but still be having a pretty good life. And some people just can't manage with a couple of those symptoms. And so I think any attempt to quantify depression, to say, okay, this is depression and this isn't, it's an artificial process and ultimately tends not to be successful.
I guess along those lines, I mean, maybe in a way you've sort of answered it, but enhancement is a word that's used in this profession to really talk about treatment for the purpose of enhancing life, not necessarily treating illness. I wonder what you think about that.
I think that we do an enormous number of things to enhance our lives, and that the novelty of these treatments and the speed with which they've broken on our society have given us a feeling of shock around them. But, you know, if one did nothing toward enhancement, one would not go to the dentist and one's teeth would fall out by the time one was much younger than I am. And if one didn't have enhancements, one one wouldn't sort of know that certain kinds of diet and exercise are actually better for you than other kinds of diet and exercise, and one wouldn't be as fit and vital as lots of people are in our society. And so I think the idea that one can improve on nature, human beings are the product of nature, so whatever we do is in a way connected to nature. Some experiments with improving on nature have gone horribly wrong, and I think we have to be careful about what we do, and we have to think it through, and we have to be informed, and we have to see what the long-term consequences are. So I don't think one should be reckless or irresponsible about it. But if there are enhancements that can be achieved, and they make someone's life better and happier at no particular cost, either to that person or to society, then I think people should not feel as though there's a moral obligation to suffer instead.
A good thing to say to a New York audience, probably the capital of psychological enhancement. Prevention is also really something that you're talking about. And interestingly, you don't have a chapter entitled Prevention. And I wonder if that's something you thought about or specifically didn't seem appropriate.
I don't have a chapter about it, though I think it's an interesting idea, and maybe in the next edition I will. I try to address it to some extent in what I write. Depression is essentially a cyclical illness, and most people who've had a depressive episode will have more depressive episodes in the course of a lifetime if they don't have some kind of treatment. There was an old wisdom that seemed to be that you had a depressive episode, you treated it, you got better, you stopped taking whatever kind of treatment it was, you went on about your life. When you had another episode, you treated that and you got better. Ultimately, I think, we've worked out that that is not the best way to treat any illness. If you have a heart attack, you don't take medication for a while and then go off it and wait until you have another heart attack and go back on medication and back to exercise for a while and then go off of it and then have another heart attack. Ultimately, your heart gets destroyed. And in the same way, your mind gets destroyed by repeated depressive episodes. And there is now clear evidence, contrary to what lots of people think, about toughing it out and that being really the noble thing to do. While you're toughing out a depression and having a severe depressive episode, that depressive episode is causing the death of brain cells in the hippocampus and a variety of other serious and severe problems, while what you can do to prevent an episode does not seem to have permanent brain damaging qualities. And you, in fact, really save your own brain by remaining in some kind of treatment. I think it's very important for people who've had more than a couple of episodes to remain in treatment and to keep the episodes at bay. The problem, so far as I'm concerned, the biggest problem is that the treatments we have mostly come at a certain price. And some of the time the price seems too high. And so almost everyone I know who's taken medication on a continuing basis has at some stage felt, I just don't want to be on this medicine anymore. I've gained 30 pounds, which I didn't want to have, or I've lost all of my sexual function, which used to be a source of some satisfaction to me, or whatever it is. These are side effects which are at a high cost. And so a kind of cost-benefit analysis has to be constantly done. But there's no question that having a lot of depression over and over again is bad for you, and that managing to control the depression is a much better strategy if you can find a way to do that. And I've been dwelling a little bit on medications. There are obviously all kinds of treatments, and each of them has its own benefits and its own costs, and they interrelate in lots of complicated ways. But as in almost everything, an ounce of prevention, I think, to coin an original phrase, is worth a pound of cure.
Well, this seems like a good juncture then for you to talk a little bit about, you talk about many modalities of treatment in your book. As a psychoanalyst, I would love to hear your thoughts on the different modalities, why people might choose one modality over another, or if you even think that, and what your thoughts are on the ends, the biologic treatments, the various talk therapies, and of course psychoanalysis.
I started off, when I went to write this book, as rather conservative, and I thought that there were a couple of proven kinds of talking psychotherapy and a few well-researched medications and maybe electroshock treatments, and those were the things that were effective against depression. But I came to rather a different conclusion as I continued to work on this subject. It seems to me if you're dealing with brain cancer and you have someone who tries a kind of wacky sounding therapy and then says, gee, I feel fantastic now. The person may feel fantastic, but he probably still has brain cancer and he'll probably still die from it. And so the fact that he feels fantastic, while very nice in its way, is sort of irrelevant by and large to the development of the brain cancer. But if you have depression and you try something sort of wild and marginal, and then you say, gee, I feel fantastic now, then you don't have depression anymore, because depression is a matter of how you feel. And if you don't feel depressed, you don't have depression. So I had extraordinary letters. I have had thousands of letters from people, both while I was working on the book in response to a story I'd done in the New Yorker and since writing the book. And one of the subjects people like to write to me about is the therapy that has worked for them. And my favorite was the woman who wrote to me and said she had tried 4 different medications. She had been in 3 kinds of talking therapy. She had tried a whole catalog of other things until she had finally found the thing that worked for her. And she wanted to make sure I told people about it in my book because it was so great that she'd found it and it would probably help a lot of other people. And that was making little dolls from yarn. She sent me several of them.
I need to go back to school.
But her reality was that she had been very depressed for a very long time. It was clear when I received the photo of her with several thousand of these things that she had an obsessive compulsive element in her complaint as well. But one way or another, she now felt that she was happy and she believed that she was having a good life. So I cut a lot of slack for that. All of that being said, I still think that the most effective thing is a combination of talking therapy and medication. I think it's a difficult process finding which medications work best for any given person. While about 80% of people will ultimately respond to medication, only about 40% of those people will be responsive to the first medication they try. And when people ask me about areas in which I anticipate progress in the treatment of depression, I tend to say that while I don't see any dramatically more effective medications on the horizon right now, I do think with improvements in brain imaging and a better understanding of the function of medications, we may reach the point at which we can make more intelligent initial prescriptions. Right now, you're kind of a dartboard. I mean, you sort of throw this medication there, and you throw that medication there, and hopefully you get a bullseye with something. But I think the medications are extraordinary, and I think they accomplish relatively rapidly things that would be very difficult or impossible to accomplish. But I also think that the medication is sort of like the rough focus knob on a microscope. It brings you to the point at which you can more or less see what you set out to see. But talking therapy can be the fine focus knob on a microscope. To focus a microscope using only the fine focus knob would take you 4 days of just twiddling knobs. But once you've got the rough focus, if you actually want to see the detail that was the purpose of having a microscope in the first place, you need to do that fine focus. And I think people have remission from certain acute symptoms with medication. But in order genuinely to feel better, you have to figure out who you are in the wake of a depression. You have to figure out patterns of behavior that seem to lead to depressive feelings, why you engage in certain patterns of behavior. You have to gain a comfortable and authentic self-knowledge, which is the only way really to have the feeling of any authority over or control over the depression itself. And that, I think, is definitely best accomplished in various insight-oriented talking therapies. Now, I also think that there are talking therapies like cognitive behavioral therapies, which always sound a little bit cute in a way when you read a description of what they are, but which can be very powerful in helping people to think along slightly different lines and helping them to gain real control over certain persistent symptoms. And sometimes effects similar to those achieved by medication can be achieved relatively quickly with some patients with cognitive behavioral therapy. Psychoanalysis, I think, is a fantastic model, and I'm acutely conscious that I'm talking to a psychoanalyst here, but
Yes.
I think there are huge lessons to be learned from psychoanalysis. I think most effective insight-oriented therapy is based to one degree or another on things that are learned through years of psychoanalytic practice. I had a very bad psychoanalysis with a very incompetent psychoanalyst, which I've written about in the book, which I think was one of the precipitating factors in my own depression. And so that has left me with something of a bias. I also think that in terms of the amount of time that's involved in a psychoanalysis, it's not the most efficient way of dealing with depression. In fact, I don't think it's the most efficient way of dealing with any kind of specific acute symptoms. But insofar as knowledge is power and self-knowledge gives you power over yourself, and insofar as a profound understanding of yourself allows you not only to resist perhaps certain onslaughts from an illness like depression, but also to withstand them and to be able to tolerate your own depression, I think at that kind of level, that psychoanalysis for people who have got the capacity to do it, both the financial capacity and the intellectual capacity, is a very powerful and remarkable process when it's well done. And I've certainly seen people who have felt that without their psychoanalysis, they would have experienced a great deal of agony that they were able to avoid simply through understanding themselves in the way they did after analysis.
Well, perhaps it will have a place in your new prevention chapter.
Absolutely.
I hear and understand that you're not a fan of the DSM-4, rigid set of diagnostic criteria. I understand that. But I wonder, where in your mind does depression fit in terms of what is referred to as, characterologic or, personality disorders, but different characterologic styles where depression is one of a group of symptoms of other things going on. You mentioned, I think one of the people in the book does a self-cutting sort of behavior, and which, we would definitely give a particular label. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about that?
It's frequently quite difficult to distinguish between personality and illness, and it's a very complicated process. And one has to be careful of saying to someone, your personality is an illness, at least if you want an ongoing relationship with that person. I think that the basic symptoms of depression frequently occur at a very minor level in which they don't actually constitute illness in ordinary life for almost all people, that they escalate rather gradually. And so I think depression is both, I've used the words dimensional and categoric. It's something ordinary that's been carried to an extreme, and it's also something completely new. Because when those feelings, which are ordinary feelings and which are part of the normal human mood spectrum, get too far out of control, then they begin to feel like something else completely. So I can say that when I had my first really acute depressive episode, I had a breakdown and I was terribly, terribly sick with the illness of depression. But I can also say that on Tuesday, I experienced certain kind of depressive feelings which were not completely disconnected from what happened. So I think it's a very tricky defining process. I think to some extent what we define as illness depends on what we're able to treat and to cure. So those kinds of pain that we have no solution for, we tend to try to understand as simply part of character. And those things which can in fact be ameliorated, again, ameliorated without there being sort of terribly dismal costs associated, we tend to categorize as illness. So I think it's a sort of shifting terrain. But I think essentially the question is, how do you, the person experiencing these symptoms, feel? Do you feel as though what you're experiencing is beyond what you perceive other people as experiencing? Does an outside observer who talks to you feel that that's true? And do you feel as though you're being prevented from living your life and functioning well? It really, I think, has a great deal to do with whether you're experiencing more pain than you can tolerate and whether you're able to go about the basic business of your own life. And of course, the basic business of one's life is something that varies enormously from person to person. I mean, the basic business of our president's life is sort of enormously different from the basic business of the lives of many people who have got sort of simple, straightforward, repetitive jobs and very particular constrained home lives and have remained geographically in one relatively contained place the whole time. They're just, people have different expectations of themselves. And I suppose it's an illness when expectations of yourself, which do not seem to an outside observer to be unreasonable become impossible for you to meet, having previously been things that you were more or less able to achieve.
Thank you. You are a writer. You are an artist. And you mentioned earlier that being a tortured writer felt okay in a way. But I wonder, what your thoughts are in general about artistic expression and depression.
Lots of people who have not themselves been depressed ask me in various interview settings whether I don't think depression is a wonderful inspiration for art. I think that after you've had a depression, when you come to consider what you've been through, that the depression can lead you into certain kinds of self-knowledge and knowledge of the world that you would not have had without it. And that one of the things that you want to do after you've had a depression is to somehow redeem the time of your life that it's eaten, and to try to build for yourself something meaningful out of the depression, so that the depression becomes part of the through narrative of your life. I am who I am now. I like who I am now. Who I am now is in part the consequence of the depression, rather than being this thing that you exclude from your life and want to have no part of and push aside from it. So a certain amount of artistic expression can come out of that. But while you're actually in a depression, which people sort of say, oh, but lots of poets write great poetry when they're really depressed. No, when they're really depressed, lots of poets can't get out of bed or make themselves a sandwich. They are not in their moment of writing great poetry. So I think that the depression, things can be built out of it, but I think the depression itself is a barren, bleak, desolate, uninspired state.
There are actually people who, maybe even more so bipolar, people who are afraid of treatment because they are afraid that it will rob them of their creativity. And it's a difficult question because there are some people who actually feel upon treatment that while they feel better, they are less inspired and they are less creative somehow.
I think that's very true of mania. I don't think it's so true of depression.
Interesting. Well, to switch gears a little bit, could you say something about socioeconomic status and its impact on depression, the experience and the treatment?
Yes, absolutely. That was one of the most shocking things to me. I set out, when I decided to write this book, with a number of ideas, one of which was that I wanted to dispel the notion that depression is a modern Western middle-class illness. And so I looked at a whole variety of contexts in which depression occurs. And in a way, the most shocking thing for me was looking at depression among the poor, because I heard over and over again, and continue to hear over and over again, oh, well, poor people don't have time to get depressed. It's a sort of disease of middle-class, self-conscious people. And, there's the notion almost that it's a rather aristocratic thing to be depressed. And I said that that didn't make sense, that it seemed to me depression came out of a certain degree of vulnerability, which is genetic, interacting with a certain amount of trauma in the world. Some people are very vulnerable to depression, so a very minor trauma will trigger their illness. Some people are much less vulnerable, so they need a gigantic trauma to trigger their illness. But in almost every instance, it's a matter of a gene-environment interaction. I thought, poor people experience more trauma than middle-class people. And so surely poor people should in fact have a higher rate of depression than middle-class people. Well, what I realized over time is that if you're middle class, you have a rather nice, pleasant life, but you feel terrible all the time. And you think to yourself, what is wrong with me that I feel so terrible when I have this nice life? And you go to a doctor and you say, there's something wrong. I feel really terrible, even though I have a perfectly okay, nice life. And why do you think that is? And the doctor says, well, perhaps you have depression, or you recognize in yourself that you have the illness of depression. If you're at the very bottom of the social ladder and you're barely managing to feed yourself and you've got all kinds of problems around you, then you feel terrible all the time, and you think yourself and everyone around you thinks that the way you feel is concomitant with who you are and where you are in life. And you feel terrible, but why wouldn't you feel terrible when all these terrible things are happening in your life all the time? The fact of the matter is that you can have a terrible life and still have depression. And that a lot of people who are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder think that they are depressed because their lives are so bleak. While the reality is that their lives are so bleak because they are depressed, and depression robs you of the ability to function well, to hold down a job, to form meaningful supportive relationships, to do all of the other things that would allow them to move out of the position they're in. So I went off and looked at the incredibly limited, minuscule, unacceptably limited work that is being done on depression among the poor, and located a number of pilot studies and specific hospital programs, and found people who were very poor who had been pulled in for depression treatment. In most instances, they were academic studies, and the people who were pulled in through a random screening process. And so I looked at depression among inner city urban people outside of Washington, D.C., in rural Appalachia, in some other contexts like that. The response that a lot of these people had to depression treatment was electrifying and astonishing. People would be picked up in this kind of random screening and told, you know what, you have depression, we're going to treat you. And I think of one woman in particular from the inner city outside of DC who said, I'm sorry, but I just have to go home. And I said, no, you have depression. We really want to bring you into this study. And basically, because she was so downtrodden, she wasn't able to resist the kind of strong imperatives thrown at her by the academic who was conducting this study. It was someone called Jeannie Miranda at George Washington University. When I interviewed her, she had just been enrolled, and she was describing the most terrible life to me. And she basically had not left her apartment in almost 6 months. She was living with a man who was both physically and verbally abusive of her. She had gone into a family planning clinic, which was where this random screening was taking place, to get a tubal ligation because at the age of 28, she had 9 children and she couldn't face the prospect of having any more. She had no feeling of connectedness to any of these children. She was terrified of them. She was not able even to feed them. She had her mother helping her to sort of feed the kids. She said they would just leave the house and I would hide under the bed because that was the place where I felt most safe, and lock the door, and I just dreaded when they came home again. And she was enrolled in a fairly straightforward depression treatment program, and 6 months later, which is not very long, after a treatment which had cost $82 in total, she had a job working, of all things, in childcare for the U.S. Navy. She had a new apartment, and I have passages which I unfortunately can't really quote by heart, but she turned out to be this lyrical, articulate woman who suddenly had all of these things to say about her passionate love for her children. And she kept saying, I never expected that I could ever feel like this, that I could go out of the house not feeling afraid, and to feel those bad feelings might not be coming back. And we were talking about the doctor who had been treating her, as I say, in this sort of short-term, not very complicated treatment regimen, but who had roped her into it. And she said to me, when I was in that constant despair, I prayed to the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayers. It was the most astonishing thing. And the fact that we are not entering on any kind of large-scale national program to treat depression among the poor seems to me to be not only inhumane, but also kind of economically stupid, because this was someone who had been living on welfare and who had been receiving occasional home visits from social services, whose children were all headed into the delinquency system, and who was now holding down a job and part of the economy with children who she was now close to. She worked with them on their homework, and her children all suddenly had career ambitions and so on and so forth. And astonished really by what I'd found, I went and talked to a couple of people on Capitol Hill about it. And both Pete Domenici and Paul Wellstone, the two people who've done the most for mental health issues in the United States from a political standpoint, said to me, what you're saying makes sense. It would serve the humanitarian and the economic advantage of the country to provide aggressive treatment programs in which we identify poor people who don't know that they're depressed, draw them into treatment, and see to what extent they're able to ameliorate their feelings and their circumstances. Said, but it's not going to happen. And Wellstone said to me, it's not going to happen because it would involve putting together a treatment program and entering a line item in the national budget for it. And we can't put new line items in the national budget, especially because even if that would reduce welfare and prison and healthcare costs over the long term, we can't take the money out of those services this year to set it up. He said, and then it would be a healthcare directive, and you have a Congress which deplores directives in any field, and most particularly in the field of healthcare. And then Wellstone said, and besides that, he said it would take a lot of time and energy to set this whole thing up. And we live in a representative democracy. And in a representative democracy, people who are voters are all represented on Capitol Hill. But the indigent depressed are not in the polling places on Election Day. They're at home hiding under their beds. And so they don't have a voice in this government. And the people who are not themselves indigent and depressed don't care about this issue and don't care about the people who are suffering from depression in this state of poverty. And so there is not actually any imperative on Capitol Hill to do anything about this, and we don't have time. The people on Capitol Hill don't have time to undertake a project of this magnitude if there isn't pressure from voters to do it. So since he said that to me, it's been part of my agenda, and I seize any opportunity I get, including this one, to try to make people more aware of this issue in hopes that eventually some social consciousness can build up.
That story was, of course, incredibly sad and touching, and you empathize with, you have met so many people through the research and empathized clearly in the book with so many of their stories. Some of them turn out hopeful, like this one, but many of them don't. And I wonder, what sort of a toll does that take on you? How have you dealt with the onslaught of people and their stories and the empathy, which requires some identification with what's going on with them?
I would say that it's been very taxing becoming so close to so many people who have suffered so much in the context of the suffering of those people. You as a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist must constantly deal with this, that you spend day after day after day listening to people describing their pain and their problems in the most vivid way, and I'm sure it takes a great toll also on you. I get overwhelmed by it sometimes. That being said, I feel as though the stories of hope are incredibly uplifting to me, and the feeling depression is an illness of isolation. You feel so alone when you're depressed and so cut off from the rest of humanity, and the feeling of connectedness that has then grown out of that experience of depression, insofar as I'm beyond the depression itself most of the time, has been very rich and rewarding. So it's been painful, but it's also been somewhat pleasurable, and it's in a way redeemed the depression itself so that it doesn't feel quite as hollow and empty as it felt just as I was coming out of it.
Has it changed your feelings about why you wrote the book?
Well, my hope for the book was that my hope for every book I've written was that they would change, in fact, even for articles and emails, was that they would change the world. And I don't feel that anything I've written has really changed the world, but the response I've had to this book has been a lot of it from people who've said that I changed their lives. And I had one letter that was just 2 sentences long a while ago, and it said, "Thank you for writing your book. I was planning to kill myself, but now I have some help and I'm doing well." And it was signed by the person who'd written it. And that was incredibly, incredibly gratifying. So the sense of contact that the book has given me, it's been very gratifying. And it's been greater than I think I could have anticipated when I was writing it.
And so you ended with the chapter of hope.
Yes.
And what about hope in depression?
Well, one of the things that really puzzled me as I began working on this subject was that I perceived that there were some people who had, and I touched on this a little bit earlier in response to an earlier question. There were some people who seemed to me to have the most terrible depression symptoms and yet be able to have rather rich and good lives sort of in between their bouts of depression, or even in some way during certain parts of their depression, or somehow they were terribly, terribly depressed people who had a lot going for them. And then I met other people who seemed to me to have what sounded like rather mild, rather insignificant symptoms, whose lives were completely destroyed by the depression that they had. And I guess my great question writing the book was to try to understand why these differences existed and what the nature of these differences was, and what it was that allowed some people to tolerate the illness more than others. And I found, and again, I touched on this a little bit in responding to your question about art, but I found that people who tried to shove the depression out of their consciousness tended, ironically, to be the ones who are most afflicted by it, because while they were trying not to think about it, they had the sense that it had taken over their lives, that it had destroyed big parts of their lives, and they were mostly rather bitter, angry, and resentful about the depression. And I found that there were other people who, despite having had very severe depression, had said, well, I would never have chosen this. And, the point of what I'm about to say is not that everyone should really go have a nervous breakdown, because you'll learn great things from it. But if you have to have one, and if you have to go through a sort of serious depression, then in what way can one extract some kind of wisdom or knowledge or connectedness or something from it that will redeem it? And I found that a surprisingly large number of people who had had depression, who had been treated for depression, and who now were relatively well, even if they weren't going to stay relatively well forever necessarily. But a lot of people said to me, well, I became a kinder person because of this depression. I was never so sympathetic with other people's pain before, and now I relate to people differently. Or people said to me, I used to be really arrogant in a way that actually cut me off from the world, and now that's been broken down. Or people said to me, I feel as though I just became who I am with this experience behind me, and I don't regret it, because to regret it would be to regret who I am now as myself. And then most potently, and it was something I felt very strongly, when you've had that desolation in your day-to-day life, every day that you wake up and are not feeling depressed, you feel incredibly joyful and celebratory, and you live life with an intensity that you wouldn't have bothered with before, because you know about the fragility of your own happiness. And so you inhabit that happiness more fully. And I thought, all right, there's a little bit of an element of artifice and a little bit of Pollyanna-ishness to saying, oh, I had a depression, but I'm so glad I did because of all the things that have come out of it. But actually, insofar as one can sustain that view and that attitude, one can actually go on to have a rather amazing life, in spite or around or in conjunction with one's dips into depression. And I ended the book with a chapter on hope because I wanted people to feel, who had read the book, that there was hope to be had, that actually the depression, no matter how awful it seemed, was not ultimately a completely negative, completely bad, completely barren thing. I wanted people to see how many people with terrible stories had managed to get better. And I wanted people who were considering suicide to know that if they could just manage not to commit suicide for a little longer, maybe they would actually be okay and be really glad they hadn't committed suicide. And I wanted people to feel that whatever knowledge was conveyed in the book or could be found elsewhere, that knowledge actually could make them quite strong, and that the feeling of strength you get from having withstood something like this is an invaluable feeling of strength. So I just wanted to say about depression, there are a lot of treatments. It's quite likely that you'll get completely better. It's quite possible, it's quite likely that you'll get somewhat better. It's quite possible that you'll get really way much, much better and be really fine hereafter. And it's even possible that in the end, you won't look back on the depression with rancor and hatred. And so I wanted to hold out those possibilities to people who were themselves suffering with the illness.
Thank you. I'm so glad you said that. I certainly do find, I'm very struck by the fact that many people who come in who have suffered a previous depression or even, terrible anxiety disorder really have do have a certain strength or belief in their strength, in their power, and a freedom by feeling that they have been able to surmount such an event.
That's great to hear, from the mouth of someone who's actively treating people.
Definitely. One last question, and then I think we'll take questions from the audience, and that is, what now, Andrew Solomon? What will you do? What will you write? Are there plans?
I'm in the midst of actually a number of plans at once. I'm working sort of slowly on a book about relations between parents and children, but my current real focus is a project about memory and trying to understand, in an era in which machines have better memories than people do, what the quality of human memory is in the face of that, and what it is that we value in human memory, and how understanding of what we've experienced or of our own past determines who we are. And the depression-related part of it is that I want to write about regret, which seems to me to be such a persistent and such a powerful human emotion, and about why we experience it and what constitutes regret, and whether there's some strength in regret or whether it's something to be recovered from. So that's sort of my focus at the moment.
Well, we'll be waiting. Sounds interesting. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll try to see. Oh, good. I'll just repeat the question so everybody can hear it. Would a school system be an appropriate place to do a screening process for everyone to look at a predisposition for depression? This was.
I think that it's extremely important that we do better screening for mental illnesses generally early. There's a lot of confusion, I think, around the idea of children's depression. I often hear parents saying, well, I mean, it's probably a phase and you should just let them go through it naturally. And if it turns out to be a problem when they're older, we'll deal with it then. And that's an incredibly misguided idea, because if you address the depression early and give the child a childhood and an adolescence which are not dominated by the depression, then there's a reasonably strong chance that that child will go on to a fairly healthy and fulfilling adulthood. And if you don't, the chances of that child being, a depressed adult are enormously, enormously high. And so I think it's important to do screening as early as possible. I think there should be some mental health screening, not only for children, but also for adults every time they go to see their GP for an annual checkup. That they're just more screening on mental health issues would be a very good idea, because like any kind of illness, if you catch it before it gets very severe, it's much easier to treat than it is when it gets very severe. I certainly, with my own original breakdown, did the dumb thing that everyone does of thinking, I'll just fight through this and I'm going to get through this and I'm not going to, until I was unbelievably sick. And I think if I had gone for treatment 6 months earlier than I did, I wouldn't have had a book, which would have been a shame. But other than that, I would have been in much better health altogether. The problem is that while it's somewhat difficult to to recognize a problem which is already becoming fairly full-fledged. It's really very difficult for people who don't have a lot of intuition and a lot of experience to recognize illness very early on. So I think we could pick up on a lot of children who are quite depressed, even entering first grade, and that would be fantastic. What you've suggested is that we pick up on children who are not yet depressed but will become depressed, and that's a little bit like trying to predict, who's going to develop any other kind of illness. I mean, there are some signs and there are some pointers, but and we discover sort of genetic vulnerabilities, and as our brain scanning gets better, maybe we'll be able to do something with that. Essentially, I think what you're proposing is more than we can do, but we could do much more than we are doing, and we should.
Maybe I'll also just add that education is so, that even if within the school systems we were able to educate teachers and, the contact people what the symptoms of depression are, so that it's not just about, this kid is badly behaved or so on. And of course, unfortunately, the stigma and shame issue so enters into things that for a parent to take a child for treatment is such, it's not only the stigma, shame of your own personal narcissistic injury of feeling that your child needs treatment is a very hard thing for many parents to do. And actually, this is something, in addition, you mentioned the general medical office. I think, the Andrea Yates case was, a horrendous example of many of these problems, and in many OBGYN offices, the issue of what is baby blues, what is postpartum depression, and what is postpartum psychosis, which is something that you would hope would be explained just like, this is how you take care of your, cesarean section wound, and this is how you treat your breast for breastfeeding would be part of the education, but it's not.
That I feel is absolutely true. And I feel the public health system fails frequently, and it only gets noticed in a case like Andrea Yates, but it happens all the time. The choice of the title was the question. I chose the title, it's a quotation from the 91st Psalm as translated in the Middle Ages, and the passage refers to the Noonday Demon. There are other demons that wasteth by day, but something is the depression that wasteth, other demons that wasteth by night, but depression is the demon that wasteth even at noonday. Cassian sort of put the spin on it that it was about depression. I just thought it was such a powerful metaphor for depression. I feel as though it's true, you have lots of other problems that kind of wax and wane, but depression, when you're really in the throes of it, it just never leaves you. It's there all the time. And like a demon, it at once inhabits you and becomes a part of you and remains like the demon something which is external to and separate from you. So I thought it was a very strong metaphor. And when I came across these medieval references to it, I thought, that's the title. Anxiety and depression. Yes, they are very closely tied, both experientially and biochemically. The cortisol system, which is really the one that gets all confused in anxiety or dysregulated in anxiety, is very much connected to the serotonin system, which is implicated in depression. If you do anything to either of those systems, you're likely to affect the other one. My own experience is that the depression, withdrawal, nullness, deadness part of the complaint is miserable and awful. But if you said to me, you will have to be depressed from July 15th to August 15th, I would say, well, I'm very unhappy to hear it, but okay, I guess if I have to do it for 30 days and I know it will end, I'll do that, or 31 days. If someone said to me, you'll just have to have a severe anxiety problem from July 15th until August, I would say, I'm sorry, I can't do that. It's out of the question. I mean, the anxiety is so intolerable and so tolerable. You feel like you're about to explode. You feel the way that you feel if you trip and fall in that second before you hit the ground, but instead of having that total out of control, hysterical, oh my God, I'm helpless, what am I going to do, feeling for 3 seconds, you have it hour after hour, day after day. And I think that people who kill themselves mostly do it to escape the anxiety, because The depression, while bleak, is sort of tolerable, and the anxiety is really, really intolerable. And they do almost always go together. Most depressives develop a certain level of anxiety. Most anxiety disorders are accompanied by depression.
In fact, actually, many suicides occur shortly after the beginning of treatment with a medication, which often induces a little bit of anxiety, and they
Yes.
get energized enough, anxious enough, organized enough to actually commit suicide. It's very true.
Keeping in mind that most people who suffer from depression want to not suffer anymore, what in your mind, what percentage of treating yourself is targeting the right medications, and what percentage of it is making an effort to really go through treatment and deciding I'm going to do this and I'm going to fight this and I want to be better and I want to know how to do it?
So the question was, what percentage of dealing with depression is finding the right treatment, the right medication, versus making the decision to go into treatment?
Not to go into treatment, but to learn how to think about. I mean, I asked this question because of the article that was in the Wall Street Journal about cognitive therapy, which, as I understand it, teaches you how to take a situation that will make you very depressed and look at it in a different light, and then maybe this isn't so bad. And how effective can that be in conjunction with the right medications or as a substitute for them, or just to what extent are we responsible for making that decision to not only find the right medications and depending only on that, but also to, do you understand?
Yes, and let me try to answer it. And if some of you didn't quite hear the question, I think it'll become evident in the response. Antidepressant medication is probably the most immediately effective treatment for depression. Depression tends to escalate and get worse. When you realize that you're depressed, I think you should do everything that you can, even if it's 6 different things at once, to get better. So the idea of sort of spending a lot of time thinking, well, should I go for this treatment or that treatment, seems to me sort of irrelevant. I would say medication, just because it has the best track record, is probably the thing to run for. But I think antidepressants help those who help themselves, and that there is an idea, which is quite a dangerous idea, fostered by a lot of misapprehensions that have grown up, especially, I think, since the big publicity for Prozac, that you're depressed and you take some Prozac or you take some other medication and you sort of sit back and wait for it to make you better, and you don't have to play a role in the whole process. The reality is that you have to make the effort to find out what treatment will work for you. You have to find that treatment, and then you have to keep trying to fight back against the depression. And you have to keep doing whatever you can. And maybe all you can do on a certain day is to try to think a positive thought for 3 minutes, or maybe all you can do is to just force yourself to get up out of bed and walk across the room once. And if that's all you can do, that's all you can do. And you shouldn't feel under horrible pressure as though you're supposed to be going out dancing when you're not capable of doing that. But you should push yourself to do what you can do, because you will not recover from depression if you don't continue to press yourself and to try to force yourself forward. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which you mentioned, is involved in that process of using a certain amount of drive and self-discipline. I would tend to think it works best in combination with other therapies. I think the business of pushing yourself, however, is absolutely essential, whatever the therapeutic decision you make is.
But certainly, I would just add that psychotherapy, that understanding psychological reasons that you may be there in the first place. I mean, the medication will also address the biologics of what's going on, but that understanding, as you brought up, why you do, what your defenses are, what partially brought you there in the first place, in terms of not only bringing you out of the depression, but not going back in, is, in terms of making the decision. I think for a lot of people, making the decision to understand themselves so that they won't be back there again is really crucial. So the question is, should a medical doctor be prescribing psych?
At this point, there are even physician's assistants who can prescribe
Yes.
mind-altering drugs, and I think that's very dangerous.
I think that the issue is not so much that it's dangerous for people to prescribe these medications without a lot of knowledge, because the medications will do something terrible to people. Because by and large, with most of the antidepressant medications that are used nowadays, if you don't have any problems and you take the medication, you will get no change in your personality and a bunch of side effects, and you will probably figure out that you should stop taking them. And if you do have but the problem is that getting medication which is really effective when you are suffering from depression is an art. And while I think there are some people who have got such a block against the idea of seeing a psychiatrist or a psychopharmacologist that the only humane thing is to have their GP write a prescription, I think by and large there is, and I say this with the utmost respect for the medical profession overall, but there is a lot of arrogance on the part of doctors who think that they just get a patient, the patient is depressed, the last patient did well on such and such a medication, I'll just prescribe that same thing at that same dose for this same patient. And people don't get the medications that could help them. It's one of the things I did not understand when I was writing the book, and that I do understand now on the basis of my interactions with people who have had medication prescribed for them. I meet all these people who sort of say to me, well, I went to my doctor and he prescribed Wellbutrin for me, and I just felt really nervous all the time. And, I've been feeling really nervous already. I just even felt worse. And I say, well, did your doctor consider a less activating medication than Wellbutrin? Well, I don't know. He just seemed to think Wellbutrin was a good drug. He said I should just stick with it. But you say, no, that is the wrong medication. And often I hear people describe things and I think that's the wrong dose. And I think that, but I don't then try to write them a prescription for the right dose, because I recognize that someone who knows a lot more than I do should be doing that. And so I think there is enormous danger in having prescriptions written by people who are not really knowledgeable. Not danger that people who don't need medication will get it, but that people who really need helpful medication will end up on unhelpful medication. And in order to get optimum results from your medication, you frequently need a combination of medications in order to prevent side effects. I meet people who describe these horrible side effects, and I say to them, well, if you took such and such along with the medication you're taking, you might have lower side effects. Perhaps you want to ask your doctor about that. And their doctor doesn't seem to know anything about it. It's an art. It's a very subtle art, psychopharmacology. It is not a straightforward matter. It's not like prescribing antibiotics, which can also be an art, but it's more straightforward. And unqualified people who are in a context in which there is access to qualified people should be giving their patients access to those people.
I'm afraid we only have time for one more question. One question. Front here.
The bipolar treatment, if it cures or helps the depression, it can also mitigate against the mania. Does it depress the creativity?
The question is about treatment for bipolar illness and whether it depresses creativity. Mania in its really extreme forms is extremely destructive, and manic depression or bipolar illness is a very serious illness with a very high mortality rate. I recently met someone who explained to me that he didn't want to get treatment for his manic depression, which was relatively mild, but that he didn't want to get treatment for it because when he had tried treatment, he felt that he couldn't write as creatively. And then we talked about all of the things that he couldn't do because he was manic depressive, like form a relationship or finish any of the books that he was working on, any of the 8 novels he was writing at the same time, or lots and lots of other things. And I tried to bring him around to seeing that while there are losses to treating manic depression, there are also enormous gains to treating it. Again, finding the right balance of medications that has the least damaging effect on creativity is important, and being in psychotherapy may allow you to sort of work more intelligently with the medications you take and may allow you to achieve insight and remission that you wouldn't otherwise have, and may mean that you don't have to sort of limit the mania quite as much as you do if you don't understand it and are therefore more subject to its wayward occurrences. But I think the idea in general is that you should try not to have a severe mental illness insofar as you can manage not to have one, and but not to over-medicate and not to over-treat at the same time. It's finding an intelligent balance is really the answer.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful and interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.